In 1917, American boys are off to fight in Europe. But first, America must prepare its military for the fight. The American military was undermanned and ill-equipped for World War I. Only 200,000 men were in the army at the time that America declared war, and the trainees had no real weapons to train with. Instead of guns, most trained with broomsticks. In order to prepare the American military and boost its numbers, Congress passed the Selective Service Act. This enacted a draft for the U.S. military, requiring young men starting at the age of 18 to register for military service. 24 million men registered, and 3 million men were called into service. Despite these huge numbers of Americans calling to serve, the Army still remained segregated, with white and black regiments fighting separately. It wasn't just the number of soldiers that needed to be boosted, it was also the equipment. Factories converted assembly lines from making cars into making military goods. Soon, American factories were churning out massive numbers of tanks, submarines, planes, guns, and other ammunition to help America win the war. Now we need to get our men and our weapons to Europe. In order to do this, the United States used the Convoy System. Navy destroyers escorted cargo ships that carried our men and our supplies across the Atlantic Ocean. These heavily armored naval ships would surround the more vulnerable cargo ships, protecting them from German U-boat attacks. The Convoy System was successful and dramatically cut the losses due to submarine attacks in the Atlantic Ocean, while at the same time safely getting our men and our cargo to Europe.
Once arriving in Europe, the American military went to work. American troops formed the American Expeditionary Force, known as the AEF. Led by General John Blackjack Pershing, the AEF fought as a separate army from other Allied forces. They infused new blood into the Allied effort and were affectionately known as Doughboys and Yanks. World War I was known as the first modern war and introduced the era of mechanized warfare. We see the introduction of tanks, airplanes, machine guns, and poison gas, along with other weapons of mass destruction. Americans quickly learned that old tactics like trench warfare and running in lines would not work against these new advanced weapons. World War I also introduces new terrors of war. Naive US soldiers suffered shell shock. Shell shock is a form of PTSD, or post-traumatic stress syndrome. The constant shelling of the battlefield traumatized these men and permanently scarred their minds. Other horrors include infections to the feet and the mouth known as trench foot or trench mouth. We also see American heroes on the battlefield. One such hero is Alvin York. York was one of the most decorated soldiers in the United States Army. He received the Medal of Honor for leading an attack on a German machine gun nest, taking 32 machine guns, killing 20 German soldiers, and capturing 132 others. Another hero is Eddie Rickenbacker. He was an American fighter ace and a Medal of Honor recipient. With 26 aerial victories, he was America's most successful fighter in the war.
While American forces are fighting on European battlefields, America prepares for the fight on the home front. To deal with unprecedented war needs, Congress gave President Woodrow Wilson new economic powers. Wilson delegated these new powers into various agencies. The first agency was the War Industries Board. It applied price controls to raw materials and resources, keeping costs low and allowing American businesses to make more guns and supplies for the war effort. It also reduced waste and allowed mass production to boom. The second was the Fuel Administration. This rationed gasoline and coal and other types of fuel here at home so that we can send them overseas for the war effort. Rationing gas and other fuels here at home meant that we would use less for our cars, ensuring that it would make its way to the battlefields in Europe for the American Expeditionary Force. It also instituted daylight saving time, which is why we set our clocks back in the fall and we set our clocks forward in the spring. The third agency was the Food Administration. This group urged Americans to go without certain food products like wheat, sugar, and meat on certain days of the week. It also encouraged Americans to plant their own victory gardens in their front and backyards, so that more of our food grown here at home could make its way to our troops in Europe. The last agency was the National War Labor Board. This group improved factory conditions and banned child labor, but also focused on settling labor disputes during the war. If labor unions decided to strike for better working conditions during the war, it could hurt our ability to win the war. The National War Labor Board acted as an arbitrator to ensure that American working conditions were proper and would prevent worker strikes during the war.
With all this happening on the home front, America grew enormously wealthy during the war. However, the wealth was unevenly divided. Corporations saw high demand for war supplies, which meant high prices, big sales, huge profits, and stock values rising thousands of %. Farmers also saw benefits. With high prices, farmers made profits. They were able to buy more land and plant more crops. Because the demand for food was so high on the home front and in the war, farmers were able to gain huge profits. But the average American didn't benefit as much as the others. With wages and income rising and prices spiking, families didn't benefit so much. They may have made more money, but they were also paying more for products.
The intense effort on the home front to win the war also bred intolerance and suspicion in the general population. American society turned on its own and its constitution during the war. A massive wave of anti-immigrant hysteria swept the country. Eastern Europeans, particularly those of Germanic heritage, faced prejudice due to the fact of suspected treachery and espionage on behalf of the Central Powers. Many Americans felt that immigrants that came from the countries of the Central Powers might be helping them by spying on the United States. Soon, German food, music, and books were banned, and German names were changed. Sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage. Hamburgers became Liberty sandwiches. Even American families who had German last names changed their names to escape this suspicion. Even the U.S. government attacked civil liberties of citizens. The Espionage and Sedition Acts, passed in 1917 and 1918, made it illegal to criticize the government and the war effort. Like the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1789, these acts violated people's First Amendment rights to freedom of speech. Both laws heavily targeted socialist and labor unions because they feared that they were working against the war effort. If you spoke out against the president or talked about the war, you were under threat of being jailed under these acts.
The war effort also brought social change at home. Both African Americans and women were affected greatly by World War I. World War I brought about the Great Migration. African Americans left the South and moved to northern cities in droves. They filled factory jobs left vacant by men going to war. They also fled racial discrimination and agricultural servitude. During the war, every northern city saw a spike in African American population. Women's roles were also expanded in society. With men away at war, women filled their factory jobs at a lower wage. Their work and blue-collar jobs gave support and credibility to the women's suffrage movement. This was the movement to give women the right to vote.
If American troops infused new energy on the battlefields of Europe, the war effort at home infused new energy in American society. It showed the American people what they could be. The American military has flexed its muscle, showing its might as the strongest military on earth on European battlefields. American industries have churned out the supplies of war in mass numbers. We've begun to tackle our social issues, allowing groups to contribute to the war effort and show their worth to their fellow citizens, and uniting Americans in the cause of defending democracy everywhere around the world.